Hello, I'm Karen Whitmire, and today I'd like to talk to you about what new relationship energy is. When people first start learning about non-monogamy, they regularly hear this term, new relationship energy, sometimes abbreviated to NRE. It can come with a warning or excitement, but it is something that many people experience at some point in their life. To some, it's a wonderful feeling that you chase, and it lets you know that you're on the right track for building a deep connection with another person. To others, it can be a field of red flag landmines that should be avoided at all costs. And to others, it's this elusive thing that seems to only exist in romance stories or literature and feels like something that's been exaggerated by writers for dramatic effect. And to be clear, it is not something just exaggerated by writers for dramatic effect. It is a thing that exists, but not all people experience it. So today I want to take a closer look at this phenomenon and how to identify when you are experiencing strong forms of NRE. So first I want to introduce you to a term that has often been dismissed in the psychological and therapeutic circles called limerence. Limerence was studied by Dorothy Tenov in the 70s and early 80s, and there's a book about it. Limerence is a state of developing attachment that can sometimes border on the obsessive. The thing to which you are attaching is called a limerent object, or shortened often to LO. It is specifically referred to as an object, even if it's another person, because you experience the limerent object as you want to see it or them. You see it as inside this fantasy bubble of your own making. Sometimes this fantasy bubble is subtle, and sometimes it's very blatant. So while Tenov studied limerence in terms of people attaching to other people, I've seen people in my own private practice experience a state similar with new jobs, new friends, or even in chasing desires for new objects that they then quickly discard once they obtain them. As a limerent person myself, I've had much more of it in my early teens and early 20s, and it is a lot less intrusive as I enter my middle age, thankfully. But I've certainly seen parallels when starting a new job or getting a new car in my own life. The experience of NRE and limerence, it changes to various degrees in different people. So people experience this all over the spectrum. Turns out most phenomenon, or nearly pretty much all phenomenon, I would go out on a limb to say, exists in a spectrum in nature. So at one end of the spectrum is obsession to the point of physical harm or emotional harm to the self or to others. These symptoms might be so exaggerated that people are willing to go to some pretty extreme ends to they behave at extreme ends on them. At the low end of the spectrum, someone doesn't experience this at all, and we call this a non-limerent person. And a non-limerent person is often confused by the behaviors of people who are experiencing limerence, especially if it's directed at them. The fact that there are so many non-limerent people out there is one of the reasons that this concept gets dismissed in academic circles. So let's look at what Tenov describes as the symptoms of limerence, and you'll see how this relates to NRE. So the first symptom, intrusive thoughts and fantasies about the limerent object, and this might look like planning things together for the future or imagining how attractive your babies will be when you are 2 months into the relationship. This is kind of at the low end. Extreme thoughts and fantasies might be, you're having limerence towards someone who is a celebrity, and at the extreme end, you're imagining how the celebrity might come pick you up and whisk you away to some fantasy life. The next symptom that you might see is a strong desire for reciprocation of emotions. You really want the other person to feel the same way that you feel about them. And you might spend a lot of time analyzing everything about what they are saying or doing, attempting to find this evidence for or against the reciprocation of these feelings. And that for or against might really be dependent on whether you tend to be more depressive or how much you are really thinking that they are actually caring about you deeply. The next symptom is exaggerated dependency of mood on the limerent object's actions. So if they are giving you a lot of attention, you are very elated. If they're not giving you any attention, you're very depressed, lost, and lonely. And this is more exaggerated than if you weren't feeling limerent towards someone. Like if you were just mildly limerent, yeah, you might be a little sad that someone isn't texting you back. But if you're very limerent, like you are extremely distressed by the fact that someone isn't getting you back to you right away. Next, you might feel insecure or some shyness around your limerent object. You may become very aware of how you look or think about how you come off around them, especially if you aren't actually dating them at this point. If they're just someone that's sort of across the room and you have a crush on them. You might avoid talking to them even though you really want to, and you might overanalyze whether or not you should or shouldn't try to talk to them. Spend a lot of time sort of in your head about, do I approach or do I not approach? Should I text them back? We just went on a date. Should I text them back already or should I wait a day or two? This kind of stuff. So the next one is intensification of feeling in the face of adversity. And it's a lot of words. What do I even mean by that? So anything that could possibly get in the way of connecting with your limerent object will increase the feelings of limerence. And this is one of the reasons that veto power can end up being so destructive in certain situations. And I like to think about this in terms of, think about how all the greatest romance stories have some barrier standing between the two love interests, right? And the greater the barrier, the more the build up, right? That's not just dramatic effect. That is limerence, right? The more you put this barrier between two people, the more the love interest grows, the more that limerence grows. And it's not just because the writers are doing that for dramatic effect. They know what this actually does as far as increasing this strong desire. So next we have the desire to behave better or look better, even when not in the presence of the limerent object. So you might start dressing better or focus more on grooming. Sometimes this comes in as being nicer to people, as if the limerent object were watching you, even if you know they aren't present. Depression can be very strong when you are uncertain of reciprocation of the limerent object's feelings towards you. So when you're out of the spotlight of your limerent object, it can be very painful. You can become depressed or despondent, especially if they are clearly outright rejecting you. That depression can get pretty strong. There is also an intensity of emotions that leaves other concerns in the background. So all of your emotions just overall during this phase can be really strong. And all of the things that we've been talking about just take up a lot of brain power. So in Tenov's research, she found that people were thinking about their limerent object between 35% and 100% of the time. And when you're devoting that much time to analyzing whether another person is interested in you, whether or not every movement they're making is an indicator of whether they like you or don't like you, then, and your mood is highly dependent on them liking you, then other concerns start to seem pretty inconsequential. And sometimes, you notice this in oh, I just had a really great time with, my new partner. and we just had some really amazing sex all night long, and then you go into a job that you're maybe not all that interested about, and suddenly you don't care that you don't like your job that much because you feel so good about the time you just had with your partner. There's also a tendency to maximize the limerent object's positive features and minimize their negative features. And this is part of the limerent fantasy. And what tends to be the most objectifying part of this really objectifies the person on the other side. When you are limerent, you are only seeing the other person as a projection of your fantasy, not as they really are. And it can take some time for that fantasy to dissolve and for reality to really become apparent as to who this other person actually is. There's also often a desire for exclusivity and an inability to react limerently to more than one person at a time. And this is one that Tenov was insistent about in her book on limerence, even while discussing open relationships, which she basically dismissed in the book. And because of her treatment of this and other people's treatments of limerence, I have a lot of questions about this particular thing, because I do see it show up in non-monogamy in forms of like, is this part of what might be coming up in terms of jealousy and people's jealousy? So they maybe think that they're non-monogamous, but they're experiencing jealousy because of the limerence is telling them that there should be some exclusivity. Or people will often, not have really strongly want to date anyone else. They're like, I've got a new love. I don't really feel like dating anyone else. They might still be, non-monogamous in general, but they're behaving very monogamously at the time that they're experiencing limerence. And so I have a lot of questions about this one specifically, but I'd also be very interested in hearing from other people in the community who either don't experience NRE in this way, in this limerent way. Maybe they experience it in other ways, or they don't experience the full range of NRE in this limerent way, or they don't experience NRE at all, or I'd frankly be really happy to hear from people who totally experience NRE in this way and have a great story to tell me about it. So just maybe go through this list again, think about the ways that this affects you, and consider whether or not you feel like this describes your experience of NRE. So a couple questions that come up when going through this list. First, isn't this just attachment? And I will cover this a lot more in a later blog post, but limerence is wholly separate from your attachment style. People will say things like, oh, that just sounds like a crush, or that's just preoccupied attachment style. But limerence is a temporary biochemical state that goes away after a little while. Your attachment style may influence the way that your limerence expresses towards your LO. Limerence comes and goes. Attachment is a more persistent aspect of your personality that is persistent over time. Attachment tends to only shift through experience, positive or negative, and it shifts through intentional work. So don't confuse limerence with bonding. Limerence feels like bonding, but it is a temporary bond. Lasting bonding, the attachment system, is a very different process. And the other question that people come up with is, isn't this just falling in love? Right? So NRE and limerence are not love, but many people who experience it consider it to be an indicator of falling in love. For non-limerent people, love is a very different concept where bonding and attachment are experienced differently. I often think of this state of mind as more of an addiction, and it physiologically is similar to an addiction in many ways. Many heroin addicts claim that heroin feels like falling in love, but I don't have personal experience to know if this is true. However, it works on a lot of those similar brain chemicals, so I wouldn't be surprised. True, lasting, enduring love is a choice that you make every day to be with someone, regardless of whether or not they happen to be pissing you off that day. So love tends to be a slightly different thing depending on how you're defining it, right? Love can be defined in a lot of different ways. So this longer enduring way is a healthier way of viewing love, since it doesn't require this strong but ultimately fleeting and labile emotional state to tell you what's going on. So, like I said, I would like to hear your stories about love, limerence, and NRE. Which of these ways do you experience it, and for how long, and how do you feel about them? Are you someone that doesn't experience limerence or NRE? If not, how do you bond or feel yourself falling in love with someone? And if you want me to email me, or if you want to email me with your story at info@nonmonogamyacademy.com, I'd love to read them. I also may want to reach out to some of you and conduct a more in-depth interview. So if you're open to that, please let me know. I hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.